Damian Cross fell to his knees in the middle of the throne hall, and every guard in the room froze in shock. Blood dripped from his nose, black as ink, and the veins on his neck rose to the surface like dark roots spreading under his skin. He gripped the edge of his throne and pulled himself up, refusing to let his pack see him weak. But his legs shook, and for the first time in 10 years, the strongest alpha in the Northern Territories felt fear crawl into his chest. It had started 3 weeks earlier. A dull ache behind his eyes, a tremor in his hands during meetings. He had ignored it, blaming exhaustion, blaming the weight of ruling a kingdom that stretched across 5 territories and answered to no one but him. But the ache had grown into something else. Something that whispered under his skin at night and made his wolf howl in pain instead of strength. His personal healer, an old and steady man named Otis, had run every test he knew. Blood drawn under moonlight, herbs burned and read for smoke patterns. Nothing explained the black veins or the way Damian's wolf seemed to be shrinking inside him, retreating from his own body like it was trying to escape something. Tonight, Damian had collapsed in front of his council, his warriors, and the servants who kept his castle running. He could see the fear in their eyes, and he hated it more than the pain in his chest. An Alpha King was supposed to be unbreakable. He was supposed to be the wall that protected his people from every threat in the world, not a man crumbling on the floor of his own hall. "Get everyone out," Damian said, his voice a low growl even in weakness. "Now." The guards hesitated, but one look from his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered man named Caleb, sent them scattering toward the doors. Caleb stayed behind, along with Otis, who knelt beside Damian and pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. "Your pulse is fading in waves," Otis said quietly, "like something is pulling the life out of you and giving it back, over and over." "Then find out what it is," Damian snapped, though the anger cost him more strength than he had to spare. He sat back against the throne, breathing hard. "I did not survive 2 wars, and 100 assassination attempts to be taken down by a mystery illness." Caleb crossed his arms, his jaw tight. He had served Damian since they were young wolves, training together in the eastern woods, long before Damian became king. He was one of the few people who dared to speak plainly to him. "This isn't an illness, Damian," Caleb said. "Look at your arms." Damian looked down. The black veins had crawled from his neck down to his wrists, forming patterns that looked almost deliberate, like something had been carved into him from the inside. He had seen many wounds in his life, claw marks, burns, the scars of silver blades. He had never seen anything like this. "It looks like a mark," Otis whispered, almost to himself. He reached for Damian's arm and traced the pattern with careful fingers. His face went pale. "I have only read about this in old texts. I thought it was myth." "Speak clearly," Damian ordered. "I don't have patience for riddles tonight." Otis lowered his hand and looked up at his king with an expression Damian had never seen on the old healer's face before. It was pity. "This is the Mark Decay," Otis said. "A curse placed on alphas who reject the mate chosen for them by the moon itself. It does not happen often, because most alphas fear the old laws too much to break them. But if a wolf is cruel enough, or proud enough, to reject a true mate and mock the bond in front of witnesses, the moon itself marks them for a slow death." The throne hall went silent, except for the crackle of the fire in the great hearth. Damian felt something cold settle in his stomach, a memory he had buried so deep he thought it could never resurface. 10 years ago, in this very hall, he had stood in front of his entire pack and rejected the woman the bond had chosen for him. He remembered her face, wide brown eyes, trembling hands, a quiet strength that he had mistaken for weakness because he was young and foolish and desperate to prove himself to a father who demanded perfection. Her name was Ilara Voss. "That's not possible," Damian said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "That happened 10 years ago. If the curse were real, it would have taken me long before now." "The old texts say the curse can lie dormant," Otis explained, standing slowly, his knees cracking with age. "It waits until the rejected mate reaches a point of true acceptance of the loss, a final closing of the bond from her side. Once she stops hoping, once she truly lets go, the curse activates and begins to drain the alpha's life force. It is the moon's way of punishing cruelty that goes unanswered." Caleb's eyes widened as he understood. "You mean somewhere out there, she has finally given up on you?" Damien said nothing. He stared at the black veins crawling up his arms and felt the truth settle over him like a funeral shroud. Somewhere, years and miles away, Ilara Voss had finally closed the door on any hope of him coming back for her, and that closing door was killing him. He thought of that night 10 years ago more clearly than he wanted to. He had been 22 years old, freshly appointed as heir to the Blackthorn throne, desperate to prove he did not need weakness in his life. His father had told him that a mate from a lesser bloodline would make him look soft to the other kingdoms. His advisors had whispered about alliances that could be secured through a strategic marriage instead. And when the moon bond revealed Ilara Voss, a quiet woman from a small, unranked family, Damien had let his pride decide his fate, instead of his heart. He remembered her standing before the entire pack, her hands folded, her chin raised, despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks. He remembered the words he had said, cruel words, words meant to protect his reputation and destroy her dignity in the same breath. He remembered calling her unworthy in front of hundreds of wolves who had once respected her family. He had told himself for years that it did not matter, that mates were sometimes wrong, that the moon made mistakes, that he had done what was necessary for the kingdom. He had built an empire on that lie, becoming the most feared Alpha King in the north, ruling with an iron will that left no room for softness. But lies had a way of returning when the body began to fail. "Is there a cure?" Damien asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual command. Otis hesitated. The texts speak of only one remedy. The Alpha must restore the bond with the very mate he rejected. A true bond, freely given, not forced by desperation or fear. If she accepts him again, of her own will, the curse breaks. If she refuses, or if too much time passes, the Alpha dies. The words hit Damien like a blow to the chest. He had spent 10 years building walls so high that no one could reach the part of him that still remembered Ilara's face when he humiliated her. Now those walls meant nothing. His life depended on finding her, on convincing a woman he had shattered to save the man who broke her. "Where is she now?" Damien asked. "We don't know," Caleb admitted. "She left the kingdom the same week you rejected her, cut off all contact with the pack. As far as anyone knows, she has been living among humans ever since." Damien closed his eyes. 10 years. 10 years of silence, and now he needed to find her before his own body failed him completely. "Then we find her," Damien said, forcing himself to stand despite the pain radiating through his limbs. "Send trackers. Search every human city within 500 miles. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. I will not die because of a mistake I made when I was too proud to know better." Caleb studied his king for a long moment, seeing something in Damien's eyes that he had not seen in years. Not just fear of death, but something closer to regret. "And if we find her," Caleb asked carefully, "what makes you think she'll want to save you, after what you did?" Damien did not have an answer. He only knew that for the first time in a decade, he was terrified of something he could not fight with strength, or command with authority. He was terrified of facing the woman whose heart he had broken, and asking her to save the life of the man who had never deserved her loyalty in the first place. That night, as the black veins spread another inch across his skin, Damien Cross stood at the window of his private chamber and looked out over the kingdom he had built through fear and discipline. Somewhere beyond those mountains, in a world he had never bothered to understand, a woman he had wronged was living a life without him. And somehow, impossibly, his survival now depended entirely on her. He thought about the years of silence, the reports his spies had once brought him about her whereabouts, before he ordered them to stop watching her out of what he told himself was respect for her privacy, but was really guilt too heavy to carry. He thought about the rumors that she had built a life among humans, that she rarely spoke of wolves or packs, that she had buried that part of herself the same way he had buried his conscience. Finding her would not be simple. Convincing her would be even harder. But Damien Cross had never backed down from an impossible fight in his life, and he was not about to start now, even if this was a fight against his own cruelty from a decade ago. He called for Caleb before dawn. "Assemble the best trackers in the kingdom," Damien ordered. "I want eyes in every major human city within reach, discretion above all else. She left this world behind, and I won't drag her back into it with threats or armies. If she is found, no one approaches her without my direct order. Do you understand? Understood, Caleb said, though his eyes carried a warning. Damien, even if we find her, this isn't something you can command your way through. She's not a soldier following orders. She's a woman you humiliated in front of everyone she once trusted. I know exactly what I did, Damien said, his voice low and rough. I have had 10 years to remember every second of it. Caleb nodded slowly and left to gather his best trackers, leaving Damien alone with the weight of his past and the uncertain hours ahead. Outside, the moon hung heavy and full over the Blackthorn Kingdom. The same moon that had chosen Elara for him all those years ago. The same moon that was now slowly ending his life because he had thrown that gift away. Days passed in a blur of pain and fading strength. Damien forced himself to keep ruling, keep meeting with his council, keep the kingdom running, as though nothing had changed, even as the black veins crept closer to his heart with every sunrise. He hid his weakness behind closed doors, allowing only Otis and Caleb to see the full extent of his decline. To everyone else, he remained the unbreakable Alpha King, cold and commanding as always. But inside, he was counting days he did not know he had left. On the 5th night, Caleb returned to Damien's chamber with news that made the king's pulse quicken for the first time in weeks, not from pain, but from something dangerously close to hope. We found her, Caleb said quietly. She's living in a small city, 3 days' ride from here. Goes by the name Elara Voss still. Runs a shop of some kind. Human life, human friends. No sign she has any contact with wolves at all. Damien stood by the window, his back to Caleb, his shoulders tense. Does she know we're looking for her? No, Caleb said. As you ordered, no one has approached her. Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that separated his kingdom from the rest of the world, the same mountains Elara had crossed alone 10 years ago, with nothing but a broken heart and whatever dignity he had left her. I will go myself, Damien said finally. Damien, in your condition, the journey alone could. I said I will go myself, Damien repeated, turning to face his second-in-command with eyes that had not lost their fire, despite the sickness consuming his body. If I am going to die, I would rather die trying to fix what I broke than sitting on a throne waiting for the end to find me. Caleb studied his king for a long moment, then nodded once, understanding that no argument would change Damien's mind. Some battles, even loyal friends knew better than to fight. Then I'm coming with you, Caleb said. Damien almost refused, but something in his old friend's expression stopped him. He nodded instead, grateful for the presence of someone who had known him before the crown, before the cruelty, before the mistake that was now killing him one black vein at a time. That night, Damien stood before the mirror in his chamber and studied the marks spreading across his skin, a visible countdown to his own death. He thought of Elara's face from 10 years ago, the way her eyes had gone from hopeful to devastated in the span of a single sentence. He thought of the years she had spent building a life far away from wolves, far away from him, choosing peace over the pain he had caused her. And now he was about to walk back into her life carrying nothing but desperation and the wreckage of the man who had once destroyed hers. He did not know if she would help him. He did not know if she would even open her door to him. All he knew was that he had 3 days to reach her, and every hour that passed brought the black veins closer to his heart. For the first time in his life, Damien Cross was not marching into battle as a king commanding an army. He was walking into the unknown, as a man who had to face the truth of who he used to be, and hope that the woman he had wronged still had enough mercy left in her heart to save a life she owed nothing to. As dawn broke over the Blackthorn Kingdom, Damien mounted his horse alongside Caleb, leaving behind the throne, the council, and the safety of his walls. Somewhere ahead of him, in a city he had never seen, Elara Voss was living a quiet life, unaware that the man who once called her unworthy was now riding toward her with his life in her hands. The wind carried the scent of the mountains as they rode, and Damien felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 10 years. Not just fear of dying, but the terrifying possibility of facing the truth of his own heart and discovering that his pride had cost him far more than he ever understood. By the time the sun disappeared behind the peaks that first evening, Wayan's hands had begun to tremble on the reins, the black veins reaching higher along his neck. He gripped the leather tighter and pushed forward, refusing to slow down, refusing to let the curse win, before he even had the chance to see her face again. 3 days, 3 days to reach a woman who had every right to slam the door in his face. 3 days to find out whether the Alpha King's story would end in a quiet grave, or whether the woman he once rejected would become the only reason he survived at all. Elara Voss woke to the sound of rain against her window and the smell of fresh bread rising from the small oven downstairs. For a moment, in that half-asleep haze, she felt nothing but peace. Then, like every morning for the past 10 years, the memory came anyway, uninvited, the way it always did. A throne hall. Hundreds of eyes. A voice she had once loved saying words that had cut deeper than any blade. She pushed the memory away the way she had trained herself to do, sat up, and got ready for the day ahead. Her small bakery sat on the corner of a quiet street, in a city far from anything that resembled the world she had grown up in. No wolves, no packs, no moon bonds deciding who she was allowed to love. Just flour, sugar, the warmth of an oven, and customers who knew her only as the kind woman who made the best cinnamon bread in the neighborhood. Her friend and shop assistant, a cheerful young woman named Nora, arrived just as Elara finished setting out the morning trays. "You look tired," Nora said, tying her apron. "Bad dreams again?" "Just old ones," Elara replied, forcing a small smile. "Nothing new." Nora didn't push. She had learned over the 2 years they had worked together that Elara kept certain doors firmly closed, and she respected that, even if her curiosity sometimes got the better of her. Elara had built this life carefully, piece by piece, and she guarded it the way someone guards something they nearly lost forever. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Customers came and went, the bell above the door chiming with each arrival. Elara found comfort in the simplicity of it, the predictability, the complete absence of danger. It had taken years to build this peace, and she was not willing to let anything threaten it, not even memories that still occasionally crept into her dreams uninvited. By mid-afternoon, the rain had stopped, and Elara stepped outside for a brief moment of fresh air, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She noticed a man standing across the street, watching the bakery with an intensity that made her uneasy. He was tall, dressed simply but well, and something about the way he stood, alert and still at the same time, reminded her of the world she had left behind. She told herself it was nothing. Human cities were full of strangers, and not every tall, watchful man was a threat. She went back inside and focused on her work, pushing the small ripple of unease to the back of her mind. That evening, after closing the shop, Elara walked home through streets lined with soft evening light, her mind wandering to the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. She had built something real here, something that belonged entirely to her, untouched by the cruelty of a world that had once decided she was not enough. She did not notice the same man from earlier following at a careful distance, staying far enough back to remain unseen, close enough to keep watch. The next morning, Nora burst into the bakery with wide eyes and a stack of gossip fresh from the neighborhood. "There's someone asking about you," Nora said breathlessly. "A man came by the flower shop next door, asking how long you've owned this place, where you're from, if you have any family nearby." Mrs. Ellery said he was very polite but very persistent. Elara's hands stilled over the dough she was kneading. Did she say what he looked like? Tall, dark hair, serious face, dressed like he doesn't belong in this part of town, Nora said. "Do you know him?" "No," Elara said, though the description sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. She thought of the man she had seen watching the shop the day before, and felt her stomach tighten. Probably nothing. Maybe he's looking for someone else. But that night, lying awake in her small apartment above the bakery, Elara found herself thinking about a life she had spent a decade trying to forget. She thought about the pack she had left behind, the family that had quietly distanced themselves from her after the humiliation, the man whose rejection had followed her across every mile she traveled to escape it. She told herself it wasn't him. There was no reason for him to look for her after all this time. He had made his choice clear a decade ago, in front of everyone who mattered, and she had spent years rebuilding a life that no longer needed his approval or his presence. Still, sleep did not come easily. 2 days later, the bell above the bakery door rang, just as Elara was closing for the evening, the last customer having left minutes before. She looked up, expecting a straggler wanting one more loaf of bread, and felt every muscle in her body freeze. Standing in the doorway was a man she did not recognize, but who carried himself with the unmistakable presence of someone connected to the world she had fled. Broad shoulders, careful eyes, the kind of stillness that only came from pack training. He looked at her with something between apology and urgency. "Alara Voss?" he asked quietly. "Who's asking?" she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Caleb," he said. "I serve the Blackthorn Kingdom. I need to speak with you about something important. It concerns Damien Cross." The name hit her like a physical blow, even after all these years, even after everything she had done to build a life where that name held no power over her anymore. She felt her hands tighten at her sides, old anger and old hurt rushing back with a force that surprised her. "I have nothing to say to anyone from that kingdom," Alara said, her voice cold. "Please leave." "Alara, please," Caleb said, taking a careful step forward, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no threat. "This isn't about the past. It's about his life. He's dying." For a moment, the words didn't register. Alara stared at the stranger in front of her, searching his face for any sign of deception, any sign that this was some cruel trick meant to draw her back into a world she had left behind. But she saw only sincerity, and something close to desperation. "That's not my concern," Alara said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the shock beneath her composure. "He made it very clear 10 years ago that I meant nothing to him. Why would his death mean anything to me now?" Caleb hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Because you're the only one who can save him. There's a curse, the Mark Decay. It only takes hold when a rejected mate finally lets go completely, and somehow, it's found him." Alara felt the room tilt slightly around her. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, memories and emotions colliding in a way she had not experienced in years. She had spent so long convincing herself that she had moved past him, that the bond meant nothing anymore, that she had finally found peace without him. But some small, buried part of her had never quite let go, not completely, and hearing that her final release of hope might be killing him, stirred something complicated and painful inside her chest. "Get out," she said quietly, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Alara, I know this is a lot to take in. I said get out," she repeated, louder this time, her hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the flood of emotion she had spent a decade trying to bury. "He rejected me in front of everyone I knew. He called me unworthy. He humiliated me so completely that I couldn't even return to my own family without seeing pity in their eyes. And now you want me to save him?" Caleb did not move toward her, respecting the distance she needed, but he did not leave either. "I understand your anger. I was there that night. I saw what he did to you, and I've spent 10 years watching him build walls around himself because of it. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to at least hear him out, before it's too late for him to explain anything at all." Alara turned away, staring out the window at the empty street, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Rain had begun to fall again, soft and steady, echoing the storm building inside her. "Where is he now?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 days behind me," Caleb said. He insisted on coming himself, despite the danger to his health. He should arrive by tomorrow evening. Alara closed her eyes, feeling the careful walls of her peaceful life beginning to crack under the weight of a past she thought she had left behind for good. She thought of the bakery, the quiet mornings, the simple life she had built without wolves, without kingdoms, without the man who had once shattered her heart in front of everyone she loved. She thought of Nora, who would ask questions Alara wasn't ready to answer. She thought of the customers who knew her only as the kind baker on the corner, unaware that she had once been chosen by fate to stand beside a king, only to be discarded like she was nothing. "I need time to think," Alara said finally, turning back to face Caleb with eyes that carried both old pain and new uncertainty. "That's all I ask," Caleb said gently. "I'll be staying at the inn, near the town square. Whatever you decide, I won't force anything on you." Neither will he. After Caleb left, Alara stood alone in her darkened bakery for a long time, listening to the rain fall against the windows, feeling the careful peace of her rebuilt life tremble under the return of a name she had never truly stopped carrying somewhere deep inside her. She thought about closing the shop and leaving the city entirely, disappearing again the way she had once before, starting over somewhere new where no one from that world could ever find her again. It would be easy. She had done it once already, and she knew how to vanish without a trace. But something kept her rooted in place, some stubborn thread of curiosity, or unresolved feeling she could not fully name. Not love, she told herself firmly, not anymore, but something that refused to let her walk away without at least understanding what had brought him to her door after 10 years of complete silence. That night, sleep refused to come at all. Elara lay in the darkness of her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, memories of the throne hall replaying over and over in her mind, mixed now with the strange, unwelcome image of Damian Cross weak and dying, the powerful Alpha King reduced to something fragile because of a curse born from her own broken heart. She did not know if she believed in second chances. She did not know if the man who had humiliated her so completely deserved even a moment of her mercy. But as dawn approached and exhaustion finally began to pull her toward uneasy sleep, one thought remained clear and unshakable in her mind. Tomorrow, Damian Cross would arrive in her city, carrying the weight of a curse only she could break, and Elara Voss would have to decide whether the woman she had become was strong enough to face the man who had once tried to convince her she was nothing at all. The road into the city was longer than Damian remembered from Caleb's descriptions, and every mile felt heavier than the last, as the black veins continued their slow crawl beneath his skin. By the time he crossed the final ridge and saw the rooftops spread out below him in the fading afternoon light, his hands had begun to shake so badly that he had to grip the reins with both fists just to stay steady in the saddle. Caleb rode beside him, glancing over every few minutes with poorly hidden concern. "We should rest before going any further. You can barely sit upright." "I've come this far," Damian said through gritted teeth. "I'm not stopping now." He had spent the 2 days since leaving the kingdom, replaying every possible version of this meeting in his mind. Elara slamming a door in his face. Elara calling for guards to remove him. Elara looking at him with the same devastation she had worn 10 years ago, except this time it would be aimed squarely at him, with every right in the world. He deserved all of it. He knew that, and yet some desperate, stubborn part of him still hoped that the woman he remembered, the one with quiet strength and a heart bigger than he had ever deserved, might still exist somewhere beneath the years of distance he had forced between them. They reached the inn, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Damian nearly collapsed, dismounting his horse, his legs weak from the ride, and the disease eating away at his strength. Caleb caught his arm before he hit the ground, steadying him with the ease of a man who had done this more than once over the past few days. "You need to rest tonight," Caleb said firmly. "Whatever happens with Elara, it won't matter if you're too weak to stand in front of her." Damian did not argue. He allowed Caleb to help him inside, and once alone in his small room, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands, watching the black veins pulse faintly beneath his skin, like something alive and patient, counting down the hours he had left. He thought about Elara's face from 10 years ago more than he had allowed himself to in a long time, the way her eyes had widened in disbelief as he spoke the words that ended everything before it truly began, the way her hands had trembled, not from anger, but from a heartbreak so raw that even now, a decade later, he could still hear the silence that followed his cruelty, a silence more devastating than any scream could have been. He had told himself for years that ambition justified what he did, that a king could not afford weakness, that love was a luxury he could not indulge if he wanted to protect his kingdom from enemies who would exploit any softness they found. He had believed those lies so completely that he had built an entire life around them, becoming exactly the kind of alpha his father had always demanded, cold and untouchable and utterly alone. Now, sitting in a small inn room with death creeping through his veins, those old justifications felt hollow and foolish. He had not protected anything by rejecting her. He had only destroyed the one thing that might have made his crown worth wearing. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, filled with fragmented memories of the throne hall, of Elara's face, of the moon bond he had felt the moment their eyes first met years ago, a connection so powerful it had frightened him even then, though he had never admitted that fear to anyone, not even himself. By morning, Caleb found him already dressed and standing by the window, watching the city slowly wake beneath a pale gray sky. "You look worse than yesterday," Caleb observed grimly. "I feel worse," Damian admitted, something he rarely allowed himself to say aloud. "How much time do you think I have?" Caleb's expression darkened. Otis said the curse accelerates once it reaches this stage. Days, maybe, not weeks. Damien nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that information without visible reaction, though something inside him tightened painfully at the confirmation of how little time remained. He had built an empire, commanded armies, survived wars that had claimed the lives of stronger men, and now his entire future depended on a conversation he was terrified to have. "I need to see her today," Damien said. "I can't wait any longer." Caleb studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I'll take you to the bakery. But Damien, listen to me. Whatever you say to her, say it as a man, not as a king. She spent 10 years building a life free of crowns and commands. If you walk in there giving orders, she'll close the door before you finish your first sentence." Damien absorbed the warning silently, understanding the truth in it even as pride bristled somewhere beneath his exhaustion. He had spent so long being obeyed that he barely remembered how to simply ask for something, how to stand before another person without the weight of a throne behind him. They walked through the quiet morning streets, Damien moving slower than usual, leaning occasionally on a wall or a lamppost when the weakness threatened to overtake him entirely. Caleb stayed close, ready to steady him if needed, though Damien refused every offer of help with the same stubborn pride that had defined his entire reign. The bakery came into view at the end of a narrow street, warm light glowing from its windows despite the gray morning outside. Damien stopped several paces away, staring at the small building that held the woman who now controlled whether he lived or died. "This is it," Caleb said quietly. "Alara Voss's bakery." Damien felt something twist painfully in his chest that had nothing to do with the curse spreading through his veins. 10 years of silence stood between him and that door, 10 years of a life he knew nothing about, built by a woman he had once dismissed as unworthy of standing beside him. "Give me a moment," Damien said. Caleb stepped back, allowing his king the space to gather himself, though his eyes remained watchful, ready to intervene if Damien's strength finally gave out completely. Damien closed his eyes and thought of the moon bond, the connection he had felt the very first time he saw Alara at a gathering years ago, before pride and ambition had convinced him to throw it away. He remembered the warmth of that feeling, the sense of rightness that had settled over him in that single moment, before he let fear and expectation crush it beneath the weight of his father's demands. He opened his eyes and walked toward the bakery door. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as he stepped inside, and for a moment, Damien simply stood in the doorway, absorbing the sight of the life Alara had built without him. Shelves lined with fresh bread, the warm smell of cinnamon and yeast filling the air. Simple wooden tables where a few early customers sat enjoying their morning meals, and behind the counter, wiping flour from her hands, stood Alara Voss, exactly as he remembered her, and yet entirely transformed by 10 years of a life he had never been part of. She looked up, and their eyes met for the first time in a decade. The moon bond surged through Damien with a force that nearly buckled his already weakened knees, a warmth and recognition so powerful it momentarily overwhelmed even the pain of the curse eating away at him. He saw the same recognition flicker across Alara's face, quickly replaced by a carefully guarded coldness that told him exactly how unwelcome he truly was. The bakery fell silent around them, the few customers sensing the sudden tension without understanding its source. Nora, standing near the register, looked between Alara and the stranger in the doorway with wide, uncertain eyes. "Everyone needs to leave," Alara said quietly, her voice steady, despite the visible tension in her shoulders. "We're closing early today." The customers exchanged confused glances, but gathered their things without protest, filing out past Damien, who remained frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, drowning in the overwhelming reality of finally standing in front of the woman whose heart he had broken a decade ago. Nora hesitated near the counter, glancing at Alara with obvious concern. "I'm fine," Alara said, though her voice carried none of its usual warmth. "Please, Nora, I need to speak with him alone." Nora looked at Damien with suspicion, before reluctantly gathering her apron and stepping out through the back door, leaving Alara and Damien alone in the quiet bakery, the only sound the soft crackle of the oven still cooling from the morning's baking. For a long moment, neither spoke. Damien studied her face, searching for any trace of the girl he remembered, finding instead a woman shaped by a decade of independence and quiet resilience, someone who had rebuilt herself entirely without his help or his presence. You look terrible, Elara said finally, breaking the silence, her voice flat and unreadable. I've been better, Damien admitted, a faint, humorless attempt at levity that fell flat between them. Elara's expression did not soften. Caleb told me about the curse. About what's supposedly killing you. She crossed her arms, her eyes hard. Forgive me if I struggle to feel sympathy for the man who stood in front of everyone I knew and called me unworthy. The words landed exactly as intended, sharp and precise, cutting through whatever fragile hope Damien had carried into this room. He deserved every bit of the coldness in her voice, and he knew arguing against it would only prove her right about the man he used to be. You're right to hate me, Damien said quietly. I've spent 10 years trying to convince myself that what I did was necessary, that I had no choice, that ambition demanded sacrifice. But standing here now, I can't remember a single reason that justifies what I said to you that night. Elara's jaw tightened, old pain flickering briefly across her features, before she forced it back beneath careful composure. You don't get to show up after 10 years of silence and expect a few pretty words to erase what you did. I'm not asking you to forget it, Damien said. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. I'm only asking you to hear the truth, because you deserve to know what really happened that night, even if it changes nothing between us. Elara studied him for a long moment, her eyes moving over the black veins visible along his neck and wrists, evidence of a curse she had unknowingly caused through her own healing and moving on. Something conflicted passed across her face, anger warring with an unwanted flicker of concern she clearly resented feeling. Fine, she said finally, gesturing toward a small table near the window. Talk. But I'm not promising anything. Damien lowered himself carefully into the chair, grateful for the relief of sitting after the exertion of the walk, and the emotional weight of finally facing her. Elara remained standing for a moment, before reluctantly taking the seat across from him, keeping a careful distance despite the small table between them. My father spent years preparing me to be exactly the kind of alpha he believed the kingdom needed, Damien began, his voice quieter than his usual commanding tone. Cold, strategic, unmoved by anything that couldn't strengthen our position among the other territories. When the Moon Bond revealed you, he saw only a girl from an unranked family, someone who couldn't offer the political alliances he believed our kingdom desperately needed to survive. Elara's expression remained guarded, but she said nothing, allowing him to continue. I told myself I agreed with him, because it was easier than admitting I was terrified, Damien continued. Terrified of the bond itself, of how completely it seemed to claim me the first moment I saw you, of how powerless it made me feel, against something I couldn't control or command. I had spent my entire life learning to control everything around me, and the bond threatened to take that control away entirely. So you destroyed it instead, Elara said, her voice flat, though Damien could hear the old hurt still buried beneath her composure. Yes, Damien admitted, unable to soften the truth, even if it cost him everything. I destroyed it because I was a coward who cared more about appearing strong than about the person standing in front of me, offering me something real. I've regretted it every single day since, even when I refused to admit that regret to anyone, including myself. Elara looked away, staring out the window at the quiet street beyond, her arms still crossed protectively across her chest. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, some of its earlier sharpness dulled by the weight of memories she had spent years trying to bury. Do you know what happened to me after that night? She asked. My family distanced themselves within weeks, embarrassed by the association with someone the Alpha King had publicly rejected. Wolves I had known my entire life suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. I couldn't walk through the territory without feeling every stare, every whisper, every reminder of what you called me in front of everyone. Damien felt each word like a physical blow, deserved and unavoidable. I never knew the full extent of what it cost you. I convinced myself you would recover, move on, find happiness elsewhere. It was easier than facing what I had actually done to you. I did move on, Elara said firmly, meeting his eyes again with renewed resolve. I built a life here, away from wolves, away from crowns, away from everything that reminded me of that night. I found peace, Damien, real peace, without needing you or your kingdom or your bond. I know, Damien said quietly, and I'm not here to take that away from you. I'm here because apparently my survival now depends on something I have no right to ask for, and I need you to understand that before you decide what happens next." Ilara studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them heavy with 10 years of unresolved history. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and something that might have been the faintest trace of curiosity beneath her carefully maintained walls. "Tell me exactly what this curse requires," she said. "Everything. No omissions." Damien nodded, understanding this was the only opening he was likely to receive, and began explaining everything Otis had told him: the marked decay, the requirement of a true and freely given bond, the narrowing window of time before the curse claimed his life completely. Ilara listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, giving nothing away about what she might decide. When he finished, the bakery fell silent once more, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavy in the air between them. Outside, the gray morning had begun to clear, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds and casting soft light across the wooden floor. "I need time," Ilara said finally, standing from the table, putting careful distance between them once again. "This isn't something I can decide in a single conversation, Damien. You destroyed something in me that took years to rebuild, and I won't risk that healing just because your life suddenly depends on it." "I understand," Damien said, though disappointment flickered across his face despite his effort to hide it. "How much time can you give me?" Ilara hesitated, glancing at the black veins along his neck, something conflicted still visible in her eyes, despite her guarded expression. "I don't know yet, but I'm not making any promises, and I'm not doing this because I owe you anything. If I decide to help, it will be because I choose to, not because you demand it, or because guilt forces my hand." "That's more than fair," Damien said, rising slowly from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Thank you for at least hearing me out." Ilara said nothing further, watching silently as Damien made his way toward the door, each step visibly costing him strength he could barely spare. Just before he stepped outside, she spoke one final time, her voice quiet but firm. "Damien," she said, and he turned to look at her one last time. "I hope you understand that, even if I decide to help you, it doesn't mean I forgive what you did. Some wounds don't heal, just because circumstances demand it." "I would never expect forgiveness," Damien said quietly. "I only hope you'll consider it, whatever you decide." He left the bakery with Caleb waiting outside, the weight of the conversation settling heavily over him as they walked back toward the inn. He had said everything he came to say, laid bare the truth he had hidden even from himself for 10 long years, and now his fate rested entirely in the hands of the woman he had once believed he had every right to discard. As the black veins continued their relentless spread beneath his skin, Damien Cross understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some mistakes could not be commanded away by royal authority, or corrected through sheer force of will. Some mistakes required patience, humility, and the terrifying vulnerability of hoping for mercy from someone who had every right to withhold it entirely. Nora returned to the bakery an hour after Damien left, finding Ilara sitting alone at the small table by the window, staring at nothing in particular, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Are you going to tell me who that was?" Nora asked carefully, sliding into the chair across from her friend. "Because whoever he is, he clearly matters more than you're letting on." Ilara let out a long breath, finally looking up at Nora with tired eyes. "His name is Damien Cross. 10 years ago, he was supposed to be my mate." Nora's eyebrows rose in surprise. She had known for years that Ilara carried some kind of past connected to wolves and packs, though Ilara had never shared the details, and Nora had respected the silence rather than pushing for information her friend clearly wasn't ready to give. "What happened?" Nora asked gently. "He rejected me," Ilara said simply, the words still carrying weight even after a decade. "In front of his entire pack. Called me unworthy of standing beside him. I left that same week and never looked back. And now he's here," Nora said slowly, piecing together the tension she had witnessed earlier. "Why? After 10 years of nothing?" Ilara explained the curse, as best she understood it. The marked decay, the black veins spreading across Damien's skin, the impossible request that she somehow save the life of the man who had destroyed her dignity in front of everyone she once knew. Nora listened with wide eyes, absorbing a world entirely foreign to the quiet human life she shared with Alara. "That's insane," Nora said finally. "He humiliates you, disappears for 10 years, and now shows up expecting you to save his life? The nerve of some people." "He's not expecting anything," Alara said quietly, surprising herself with the defense that slipped out before she could stop it. "He said he understands if I refuse." Nora studied her friend carefully, noting the conflict visible beneath Alara's carefully maintained composure. "Do you still feel something for him?" Alara hesitated, the question hitting closer to a truth she had not yet allowed herself to fully examine. "I don't know. I spent 10 years convincing myself I didn't. But seeing him today, hearing him admit what he did, watching him struggle just to walk through my door," she trailed off, shaking her head slowly. "It's complicated in ways I didn't expect." "You don't owe him anything," Nora said firmly. "Whatever you decide, remember that. You built this life without him. You don't have to sacrifice your peace just because his life depends on it now." Alara nodded slowly, grateful for her friend's fierce loyalty, even as uncertainty continued to churn inside her. She spent the rest of the day moving through the bakery in a distracted haze, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation with Damien, around memories she had spent years trying to bury, around the impossible decision now resting entirely on her shoulders. That evening, after closing the shop, Alara found herself walking through the quiet streets, instead of heading straight home, needing the movement to help settle the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She thought about the years since leaving the Blackthorn Kingdom, the careful rebuilding of her identity, the slow and painful process of learning to trust herself again, after having her worth so publicly denied. She had built friendships here that had nothing to do with bloodlines or political alliances. She had built a business through her own hard work, without relying on any pack or title to give her value. She had, piece by piece, become a woman who no longer needed anyone's approval to know her own worth. And yet, standing in front of Damien that morning, feeling the unmistakable pull of the moon bond still alive despite everything, she had felt something crack open inside her that she thought she had sealed shut permanently. She did not want to feel anything for him. She resented the small, stubborn part of her heart that still responded to his presence, despite everything he had done. But resentment did not erase the reality of what she felt, and Alara had never been the kind of person to lie to herself about difficult truths, even when those truths were inconvenient. She returned to her apartment above the bakery and sat by the window, watching the last light of evening fade over the rooftops of the only home she had chosen entirely for herself. Somewhere across the city, Damien Cross was fighting to survive another night, his life slipping away with every passing hour, and the terrible truth was that she alone held the power to save him. The question was not whether she could save him. The question was whether she wanted to, whether 10 years of careful healing could withstand the risk of opening herself up again to a man who had once made her feel like nothing at all. She thought about her family, distant now after years of quiet estrangement following the humiliation Damien had caused. She thought about the whispers that had followed her through the territory in those final weeks before she left, the pity in the eyes of wolves who had once respected her. She thought about the long, difficult nights of rebuilding herself from nothing, learning to believe in her own worth without waiting for someone else to grant it to her. And she thought about the look in Damien's eyes that morning, something she had never seen in him before, not during their brief courtship years ago, not even in her memories of that final devastating night. Something that looked almost like genuine remorse, though she reminded herself firmly that remorse 10 years too late meant very little in the face of lasting damage. The next morning, Alara opened the bakery as usual, going through the familiar motions of kneading dough and arranging fresh loaves, though her mind remained elsewhere throughout the entire process. Nora watched her carefully but said nothing further, sensing that her friend needed space to work through the decision on her own terms. Just before noon, the bell above the door chimed, and Alara looked up expecting another customer, only to find Caleb standing in the doorway instead, his expression grave. "He's getting worse," Caleb said without preamble. "The healer traveling with us says the curse has accelerated overnight. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent, but I need you to know the truth of where things stand." Alara's hands stilled over the dough she had been kneading, a knot of unwanted concern tightening in her chest despite everything. "How much worse?" "He collapsed again this morning," Caleb said quietly. "The veins have reached his chest," Otis believes he has perhaps 2 or 3 days left, if that. The words settled heavily over Alara. The reality of the situation suddenly far more urgent than the careful, measured consideration she had been allowing herself. She had told herself she needed time to think, time to weigh everything carefully, but time was apparently a luxury Damien no longer had. "I haven't decided anything," Alara said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "I'm not here to pressure you," Caleb said gently. "I know this isn't fair to ask of you, and I know he doesn't deserve an easy path to forgiveness, but I've known Damien since we were young, before the crown, before the cruelty he learned from a father who valued strength over kindness. Whatever he is now, whatever he became because of choices he made, I believe there's still something worth saving beneath all of it." Alara studied Caleb's face, recognizing the genuine loyalty and concern he carried for his friend, a loyalty that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with real affection built over years of shared history. "I'll come see him," Alara said finally, the decision settling into place with a strange mixture of certainty and dread. "Not because I've decided to help. I need to understand this curse better before I make any final choice, and I want to see for myself how serious this truly is." Caleb nodded, relief visible in his expression. "Thank you. That's all I'm asking for." Alara closed the bakery early that afternoon, leaving Nora in charge despite her friend's obvious concern, and followed Caleb through the streets toward the inn, where Damien remained under Otis's careful watch. Each step felt heavier than the last, memories of the throne hall mixing uneasily with the reality of walking toward a man whose survival now genuinely hung in the balance. When they arrived, Otis met them at the door, his weathered face lined with worry, as he led them toward the small room where Damien rested. Alara paused in the doorway, unprepared for the sight that greeted her. Damien lay pale and still against the pillows, the black veins now clearly visible across his chest and creeping toward his throat, his breathing shallow and labored in a way that stripped away every trace of the powerful, commanding presence she remembered from years ago. This was not the arrogant young alpha who had humiliated her in front of hundreds of wolves. This was a man genuinely fighting for his life, and the sight of it hit her with unexpected force. Damien's eyes opened slowly as she entered, and something flickered across his weakened features, surprise mixed with a fragile hope he seemed to be trying desperately to suppress. "Alara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She approached the bed slowly, studying the extent of the curse's damage with growing alarm, despite her best efforts to remain emotionally guarded. This close, she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the visible toll of a decade of guilt finally catching up with him at the worst possible moment. "Caleb told me you're getting worse," Alara said quietly, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "It seems the curse has decided to accelerate its timeline," Damien said, a faint attempt at dark humor that fell somewhat flat given his obvious condition. "I don't have much time left, Alara. I understand if that changes nothing for you." Alara stood beside the bed, torn between the anger she still carried and an unexpected wave of concern she resented feeling for a man who had caused her so much pain. She thought of everything he had taken from her, the years of humiliation, the careful rebuilding of her shattered confidence, the family relationships strained beyond repair. But she also thought of the vulnerability in his eyes now, so different from the cold arrogance she remembered, and something about witnessing his genuine suffering made it difficult to maintain the complete emotional distance she had intended to keep. "I'm not making any promises," Alara said finally, her voice softer than she intended. "But I'm not ready to watch you die either, even after everything you did to me." Something shifted in Damien's expression, gratitude and disbelief mixing together as he absorbed her words. "That's more mercy than I deserve." "Probably," Alara agreed, though there was no cruelty in the word, only tired honesty. "I need to understand this curse fully before I decide anything further. Otis, can you explain exactly what breaking it would require?" Otis stepped forward, his expression grave as he began explaining the ancient texts he had studied, the precise nature of the bond that needed restoring, the delicate balance between genuine willingness and desperate necessity that the old magic demanded. Alara listened carefully, asking careful questions, her practical mind working through the situation with the same steady focus she brought to running her business. Throughout the explanation, she remained aware of Damien watching her, his weakened body still, his eyes carrying an intensity that spoke of hope he was clearly trying to restrain, understanding that pushing too hard might destroy whatever fragile consideration she was extending him. When Otis finished, the room fell into heavy silence, the weight of the decision settling once again fully onto Alara's shoulders. She looked at Damien, weak and dying in front of her, the powerful Alpha King, reduced to something achingly human and vulnerable. "I need to think," Alara said finally. "But I promise you this. I won't simply walk away and let you die without at least giving this real consideration. You deserve to know that much, even if I ultimately decide I can't do what the curse requires." "That's all I could ask for," Damien said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. Alara left the inn that evening, with more questions than answers, her carefully guarded heart now cracked open in ways she had not anticipated. Forced to confront feelings she had spent a decade convincing herself no longer existed. As she walked home through the darkening streets, she understood that whatever she ultimately decided, her quiet, peaceful life, had already changed irreversibly the moment Damien Cross walked back through her door. 3 days passed before Alara made her decision, 3 days of sleepless nights and long conversations with Nora, who listened patiently, even as she made her own reservations about the situation perfectly clear. Alara spent hours walking the familiar streets of her chosen city, trying to separate old feelings from present reality, trying to understand what she truly wanted, rather than what guilt or obligation seemed to be pushing her toward. In the end, it was not love that convinced her, not yet, not after everything that had happened between them. It was something simpler and more fundamental. She did not want to become a person who could watch someone suffer and do nothing, even someone who had once caused her tremendous pain. She had spent 10 years building a life defined by compassion and quiet strength, and turning her back on Damien now, regardless of history, would betray the very values that had helped her heal in the first place. She found Caleb at the inn on the 4th morning, informing him of her decision before she could talk herself out of it again. "I'll come to the Blackthorn Kingdom," Alara said. "I'll help however I can, but I need you to understand this doesn't mean forgiveness. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because 10 years have somehow erased what happened." "I understand completely," Caleb said, relief evident in his expression. "Thank you, Alara. This means more than you know." Alara arranged for Nora to manage the bakery during her absence, promising to return as soon as circumstances allowed, though privately, she had no idea how long this journey might actually take, or what it might ultimately require of her. Nora hugged her tightly before she left, whispering fierce reminders that Alara owed nothing to anyone and should protect her heart above all else. The journey to the Blackthorn Kingdom took 2 days, traveling alongside Caleb while Damien rested in a covered carriage, too weak now to endure the strain of riding on horseback. Alara found herself glancing back at the carriage more often than she wanted to admit, worry creeping in despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance. They stopped only when absolutely necessary, Otis monitoring Damien's condition carefully at each pause, his expression growing increasingly grave as the black veins continued their relentless progression. By the time the mountains finally gave way to the familiar valley of the Blackthorn territory, Alara felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of dread and unwanted nostalgia. She had not seen this landscape in 10 years. The rolling hills, the distant peaks, the great stone walls of the castle, rising in the distance exactly as she remembered them from her childhood visits, and, later, from the brief and painful weeks when she had believed herself destined to become Luna of this kingdom. As they approached the castle gates, Alara noticed the guards exchanging uneasy glances, recognition flickering across weathered faces, as they realized who traveled alongside their ailing king. Word had clearly spread throughout the kingdom about Damien's illness, and the sight of Alara Voss returning after a decade of absence seemed to confirm rumors that had likely been circulating for days. The carriage rolled to a stop in the courtyard, and Alara watched as servants rushed forward to help Damien from within, his weakened form requiring support just to remain standing. She felt an unexpected pang of sympathy, watching the once proud Alpha King struggle with something as simple as walking across his own courtyard, stripped of the strength and command that had once defined him so completely. Otis immediately took charge, directing servants to prepare Damien's chambers and summoning additional healers to assist with his care. Caleb turned to Alara, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the courtyard, where where they could speak away from the gathering crowd of curious onlookers. "You'll have your own chambers, of course," Caleb said. "Whatever you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask. I know this can't be easy, being back here after everything." "It's strange," Ilara admitted, glancing around at the familiar architecture, the memories it stirred both painful and surprisingly bittersweet. "I never thought I would set foot in this kingdom again." "For what it's worth," Caleb said quietly, "not everyone here shares the views that were expressed that night. Many of us were horrified by what happened, even if pack loyalty kept most people silent at the time." Ilara appreciated the sentiment, though the memory of the throne hall, of hundreds of faces watching her humiliation without a single voice raised in protest, remained too vivid to fully soften with Caleb's kind words. She said nothing further, allowing a servant to lead her toward the chambers prepared for her stay. The room was elegant, far grander than anything in her small apartment above the bakery, though the luxury felt hollow and unfamiliar after years of simple living. She sat by the window, looking out over the kingdom that had once rejected her so completely, wondering how she had found herself back here despite every promise she had made to herself never to return. That evening, Otis requested her presence in Damien's chambers, explaining that they needed to discuss the specific requirements for breaking the curse, now that time had grown even more critical. Ilara made her way through unfamiliar hallways, memories of the castle's layout returning slowly, despite the years that had passed since she last walked these corridors. She found Damien propped up in bed, looking marginally stronger after a day of rest, though the black veins remained clearly visible along his throat and chest, a constant reminder of how little time truly remained. Otis stood nearby, along with an older woman Ilara did not recognize, her weathered face and knowing eyes suggesting someone deeply versed in the old magic that had created this entire crisis. "This is Diane," Otis introduced, gesturing to the woman. "She's a witch from the eastern villages, well-versed in curses of this nature. She's agreed to help guide the process of breaking the bond restoration properly." Diane studied Ilara with careful, assessing eyes, the kind of gaze that seemed to see far beneath the surface of things. "You carry the mark of a broken bond," Diane said quietly. "I can sense it clearly. The connection between you and the Alpha King was never truly severed, only wounded and neglected." Ilara felt uncomfortable under the witch's penetrating gaze, unused to having her private emotional landscape so easily read by a stranger. "What exactly do you need from me?" "The bond must be restored freely," Diane explained. "Not through obligation, not through pity, and certainly not through fear of his death. The old magic can sense the true nature of intention behind any restoration attempt. If you agree to this out of guilt or duty rather than genuine willingness, the curse will not break, and the attempt itself could be dangerous for you both." Ilara absorbed this information carefully, understanding now the true weight of what was being asked of her. This was not simply a matter of forgiving Damien or agreeing to help him out of compassion. The magic required something far more personal, a genuine reopening of the connection she had spent a decade trying to sever completely. "How long do we have before it's too late?" Ilara asked, glancing at Damien, who remained silent throughout the conversation, watching her with an intensity that made her simultaneously uncomfortable and strangely aware of feelings she had tried desperately to bury. "Perhaps 4 or 5 days," Diane said grimly. "The curse accelerates as it nears its conclusion. We cannot delay much longer." Ilara nodded slowly, the pressure of the timeline settling heavily over her already conflicted emotions. She looked at Damien, weak and vulnerable, in a way she had never witnessed before, and felt the careful walls she had built over 10 years, beginning to tremble under the weight of circumstances neither of them had chosen. "I can't force feelings that aren't there," Ilara said finally, addressing both Diane and Damien directly. "I won't pretend forgiveness I haven't actually found, even to save a life. If this bond is going to restore itself, it has to happen honestly, or not at all." "That's exactly what the magic requires," Diane confirmed. "Honesty, above all else." Damien spoke for the first time since Ilara had entered the room, his voice weak but steady. "I would rather die honestly than live, because you forced yourself into false feelings for my sake. Whatever happens between us, Ilara, I need you to know that I mean that completely." Something in his words, the genuine sincerity behind them, struck Ilara more deeply than she expected. This was not the arrogant, commanding alpha who had rejected her so publicly a decade ago. This was a man who had clearly spent years reflecting on his mistakes, humbled by circumstances that had stripped away every layer of pride and privilege he once wore so easily. "I'll stay," Elara said finally, addressing the room. "I'll give this honest consideration, spend time with you, try to understand what remains between us, if anything. But I won't rush this process, just because time is limited. If the bond restores itself naturally, through genuine feeling, then we'll know the curse can break. If it doesn't, we'll have to accept that outcome, whatever it means." Diane nodded approvingly. That's the only path forward that respects the true nature of the magic involved. Otis stepped forward, addressing Elara with gentle gratitude. "Thank you for this. I know how much courage it takes to return here, to face all of this after everything that happened." Elara offered a small, tired smile, though uncertainty continued to churn beneath her composed exterior. She glanced once more at Damien before leaving the room, meeting his eyes for a long moment that carried far more weight than either of them could easily put into words. Over the following days, Elara found herself navigating a strange new rhythm within the castle walls, spending mornings walking the familiar grounds that stirred both painful and unexpectedly pleasant memories, and afternoons sitting with Damien, as his strength slowly stabilized under Otis and Diane's careful treatment, though the curse remained far from broken. Their conversations began cautiously, careful and guarded on both sides, each testing the boundaries of what could safely be discussed, without reopening wounds too raw to bear. Slowly, however, something began to shift between them, small moments of genuine connection breaking through the careful walls both had constructed over the years. Damien spoke honestly about the pressures of his upbringing, the relentless expectations placed upon him by a father who valued strength above all else, the fear that had driven him to reject the one thing that might have actually made him a better ruler. Elara listened carefully, neither excusing his actions nor dismissing the genuine pain behind his choices, allowing herself to see the full complexity of the man, rather than simply the villain she had carried in her memory for 10 years. In turn, Elara shared pieces of the life she had built after leaving the kingdom, the challenges of starting over in an unfamiliar human world, the slow and difficult process of rebuilding her confidence after such public humiliation. Damien listened with genuine attention, guilt and admiration mixing visibly in his expression, as he absorbed the strength it had taken her to create something entirely her own, from the wreckage he had left behind. Neither spoke yet of forgiveness or of the future. Both understood the fragility of whatever was slowly rebuilding between them, careful not to rush a process that demanded honesty above all else. But as the days passed, and the moon bond stirred faintly beneath the surface of their careful conversations, Elara began to wonder, despite her best efforts to remain guarded, whether the connection she thought she had permanently severed might still hold enough truth to save them both. A week into her stay, Elara decided to walk through the eastern market square, needing fresh air and distance from the heavy atmosphere of the castle, where every conversation seemed to carry the weight of Damien's failing health. She had forgotten how much she once loved this part of the kingdom, the colorful stalls, the familiar scent of spiced bread and fresh herbs, the easy rhythm of daily life among wolves who had once been her neighbors. She had not gone far before she noticed the whispers beginning, heads turning, as recognition spread through the market like ripples across still water. She kept her chin raised, refusing to shrink beneath the attention, though old insecurities threatened to resurface with every curious glance directed her way. "Elara Voss," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find an older woman watching her with an unreadable expression. It took a moment for recognition to settle in, the woman's face aged by 10 additional years, but unmistakably familiar. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elara said carefully, remembering the woman who had once run the kingdom's largest textile shop, someone her mother had been friendly with long ago. "I wondered if we would ever see you again," Mrs. Whitmore said, her tone difficult to read. "After everything that happened, most of us assumed you would never return." "I didn't plan to," Elara admitted honestly. "Circumstances brought me back." Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment before her expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, many of us were ashamed of how that night unfolded. Some things are easier to admit 10 years later than they were at the time, when speaking against an alpha's decision carried its own risks." Ilara absorbed the unexpected admission, surprised by the vulnerability behind it. I appreciate you saying that. He's changed, you know, Mrs. Whitmore continued, glancing briefly toward the castle visible in the distance. Not overnight, but slowly, over the years. He became a fair ruler, even if a cold one. The kingdom has prospered under him, whatever else might be said about the choices of his youth. Ilara nodded slowly, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected perspective on the man she had known primarily through the lens of her own devastating heartbreak. She continued through the market, encountering similar reactions from others who recognized her, some offering careful apologies for their silence a decade ago, others simply watching with curious, unreadable expressions that left her uncertain of their true feelings. By the time she returned to the castle that afternoon, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional weight of confronting a past she had spent years trying to leave behind. She found Caleb waiting near the entrance, his expression concerned as he studied her tired features. "The market can be overwhelming," Caleb said gently. "People remember what happened, even if most of them were too afraid to speak against it at the time." "I noticed," Ilara said, managing a faint, tired smile. "It's strange, hearing people apologize for silence. I didn't expect anyone to acknowledge after all this time." "Guilt has a way of lingering," Caleb observed, "especially in a kingdom that watched its future queen humiliated and did nothing to stop it." Ilara considered his words as they walked together toward the castle's private gardens, a quiet space she remembered from her brief time here years ago, though the memory now felt distant and strange, overlaid by everything that had happened since. "Can I ask you something?" Ilara said finally, as they settled onto a stone bench overlooking carefully tended flower beds. "Of course. What was Damien like before everything happened? Before his father's expectations shaped him into someone who could reject me so completely?" Caleb considered the question thoughtfully, memories of a younger, less guarded Damien clearly visible in his expression. He was different, warmer, in some ways. His father demanded perfection from the moment Damien could walk, constant training, constant lessons in leadership and strength, very little room for anything resembling genuine warmth or vulnerability. By the time you met him, he had already spent years learning to suppress anything that might be perceived as weakness. "That explains some things," Ilara said quietly, "but it doesn't excuse what he did." "No," Caleb agreed. "Nothing excuses that. But understanding why someone breaks doesn't mean forgiving the damage they cause. Sometimes it just means recognizing the deeper patterns that led them there." Ilara nodded, absorbing this insight as she watched the afternoon light shift across the garden, memories and new understanding, slowly reshaping the narrative she had carried for a decade. She had always viewed Damien's rejection as a simple act of cruelty, an arrogant young alpha choosing pride over compassion. Learning more about the pressures that had shaped him did not erase the pain he had caused, but it added complexity to a story she had once believed entirely simple. That evening, she visited Damien's chambers, as had become their routine, finding him sitting up in bed, stronger than the previous days, though still visibly weakened by the curse steadily consuming his strength. He looked up as she entered, something warm flickering briefly across his features, before he carefully composed himself. "You went into the market today," Damien said. "Caleb mentioned it." "I did," Ilara confirmed, settling into the chair beside his bed that had become familiar over the past week. It was strange, seeing so many familiar faces after all this time. "I imagine it wasn't easy," Damien said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to face that alone." "People apologized," Ilara said, watching his reaction carefully, "for staying silent that night. Mrs. Whitmore told me you've changed over the years, become a fair ruler despite everything." Damien's expression grew complicated, guilt and something like cautious hope mixing together. "I've tried to be better than the man I was that night. Whether I've succeeded is not really my place to judge." "Caleb told me about your father," Ilara said carefully, "about the pressure he put on you growing up." Damien's jaw tightened slightly, old pain visible beneath his careful composure. "My father believed vulnerability was a fatal weakness in a ruler. He trained that belief into me from the moment I could understand words. By the time I met you, I genuinely believed rejecting the bond was the only path that would prove my strength to him, and to the entire kingdom. And now, Alara asked quietly. Now I understand that true strength requires the courage to be vulnerable, Damien said, his voice carrying a weight of hard-earned wisdom. I learned that lesson far too late, and at a cost that nearly destroyed the one person who deserved better than my cowardice. Alara studied him carefully, noting the genuine remorse behind his words, the visible transformation from the arrogant young alpha she remembered into someone who had clearly spent years reflecting on the damage his choices had caused. She did not offer forgiveness, not yet, but something in her carefully guarded heart softened slightly at the honesty he continued to offer, without hesitation or excuse. I still haven't decided what happens next between us, Alara said finally. I need you to understand that clearly. I understand completely, Damien said. I'm grateful for every honest conversation we've shared, regardless of what you ultimately decide about the bond. You owe me nothing, Alara, not even this much consideration, and I won't ever forget that you've given it anyway. Something in his quiet acceptance, his refusal to pressure or demand anything beyond what she willingly offered, struck Alara deeply. She had expected arrogance, entitlement, perhaps even subtle manipulation, designed to secure her sympathy for the sake of his survival. Instead, she found only genuine humility, a man who seemed to have truly reckoned with the consequences of his past cruelty. As the days continued to pass, their conversations deepened further, moving beyond careful discussions of the past into genuine curiosity about who each had become in the years since their separation. Alara found herself laughing genuinely, for the first time since arriving at the castle, surprised by Damien's dry humor emerging slowly from beneath his guarded exterior, a quality she remembered faintly from their brief early courtship years ago. Damien, in turn, found himself captivated by the strength and independence Alara had built for herself, the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertain girl he remembered, transformed through years of hardship into a woman who needed no one's approval to know her own value. Neither spoke openly of the growing warmth developing between them, both wary of moving too quickly given everything that stood between them, both aware that the curse required genuine feeling rather than convenient timing. But as another week passed, and the black veins along Damien's skin showed the faintest signs of slowing their relentless spread, something unmistakable had begun to shift, quiet and fragile, between two people who had once believed their connection permanently broken beyond any hope of repair. 2 weeks into her stay, Alara woke before dawn with a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, a sensation she recognized instantly despite years of trying to forget it. The moon bond, dormant for so long beneath layers of hurt and careful distance, had begun to stir again, faint but unmistakable, pulling her awareness toward Damien's chambers on the other side of the castle. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, torn between wanting to dismiss the feeling as simple proximity and the honest recognition that something deeper had genuinely begun to shift between them. 10 years of careful walls did not simply crumble overnight, but piece by piece, conversation by conversation, she had felt herself softening toward the man she once believed she would never forgive. She rose and dressed, making her way through the quiet corridors toward the private gardens, where she often walked in the early morning hours before the castle fully woke. The air carried the crisp scent of dew-covered grass, and Alara breathed deeply, trying to steady the confusing swirl of emotions that had become her constant companion since arriving in the Blackthorn Kingdom. She found Damien already in the garden, sitting on the same stone bench where she had spoken with Caleb weeks earlier, looking stronger than she had seen him since his collapse in the throne hall. The black veins remained visible along his throat, but their spread had noticeably slowed, and color had returned to his face in a way that suggested genuine improvement. "You're up early," Alara said, approaching cautiously. "I couldn't sleep," Damien admitted, looking up at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something open and unguarded, in a way that felt entirely different from the careful composure he usually maintained. "I kept thinking about you." Alara felt her chest tighten at the simple honesty of his admission, unprepared for how directly it landed, despite the growing warmth she had been reluctantly acknowledging in herself. She settled onto the bench beside him, keeping a careful distance that felt increasingly artificial, given everything that had shifted between them. "I felt the bond this morning," Alara said quietly, "stronger than I have in years." Damien turned to look at her fully, hope and vulnerability warring openly in his expression. I've felt it building for days now. I didn't want to say anything, didn't want to pressure you into feeling something you weren't ready to acknowledge. I'm not sure I'm ready even now, Alara admitted honestly. But I can't pretend I don't feel it either. It scares me, Damien. Opening myself up again, after everything. It terrifies me too, Damien said, surprising her with the admission. I spent 10 years convincing myself that closing off my heart made me stronger. Watching it happen again, feeling the bond return, despite everything I did to destroy it, forces me to confront exactly how wrong I was about what strength actually means. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunrise slowly paint the garden in soft golden light, both absorbing the quiet significance of the moment, without rushing to fill it with unnecessary words. Alara found herself studying his profile, searching for traces of the arrogant young alpha she remembered, finding instead someone humbled by genuine reflection, someone who had earned, piece by piece, the cautious trust she found herself extending. Later that morning, Otis requested their presence to assess Damien's progress, cautiously optimistic as he examined the slowed spread of the black veins across his skin. Diane joined the examination, her expression thoughtful as she studied the changes. The bond restoration is clearly beginning, Diane said. The curse responds to genuine connection, and something has shifted between you both these past weeks. But partial restoration only slows the decay. To fully break the curse, the bond must be completed and openly acknowledged, not just felt privately between the two of you. What does that mean exactly? Alara asked. The old magic requires public acknowledgement, Diane explained. The rejection happened before witnesses, before the entire pack. The restoration must be witnessed as well, a formal claiming that undoes the damage of that public humiliation. Private feelings alone will slow the curse, but they cannot fully break it. Alara felt her stomach tighten at the implication, understanding immediately what this would require of both of them. A public declaration, standing before the same pack that had watched her humiliation a decade ago, this time witnessing something entirely different. I'm not ready for that, Alara said honestly. I don't even know if what I feel is enough yet to make that kind of declaration. I understand, Diane said gently. The magic cannot be rushed without risking its authenticity. But I want you both to understand the full requirements, so you can prepare for what genuine healing will eventually demand. Damien remained quiet throughout this exchange, watching Alara carefully, careful not to push her toward a decision she clearly was not ready to make. When Otis and Diane left them alone, he spoke softly, his voice carrying none of the pressure she had feared. Take whatever time you need, Damien said. I would rather die honestly than force you into a declaration that isn't fully true. I know, Alara said, grateful for his restraint, even as guilt churned uncomfortably at the thought of the ticking clock, still hanging over both their heads. I just need to be certain, Damien. This isn't something I can do halfway. That afternoon, Alara decided to walk through the castle's great hall, drawn by curiosity toward the space where her humiliation had taken place a decade ago. She stood alone in the center of the hall, staring at the throne where Damien had once stood, delivering the words that shattered her world, memories flooding back with painful clarity, despite the years that had passed. She did not hear the footsteps approaching until a voice spoke behind her, cold and unfamiliar. Strange, seeing you standing in this exact spot again. Alara turned to find an older man watching her with sharp, calculating eyes, dressed in the formal robes of a senior council member. Something about his careful, assessing gaze made her instinctively uneasy, though she could not immediately identify the source of her discomfort. I don't believe we've met, Alara said carefully. Victor Lang, the man said, offering a thin, humorless smile. I serve on the King's Council. I was present that night, 10 years ago, when circumstances required certain difficult decisions. Something in his phrasing struck Alara as odd, the careful distance he placed between himself and the events of that night, as though he had merely observed rather than participated in whatever had transpired. Difficult decisions, Alara repeated slowly. That's an interesting way to describe what happened. Victor's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes that Alara could not quite interpret. I only meant that kingdoms sometimes require sacrifices that individuals find painful, even when those sacrifices ultimately serve the greater good. And rejecting me publicly served the greater good, did it? Alara asked, old anger creeping back into her voice, despite her efforts to remain composed. The alliance considerations at the time were quite complex, Victor said, his tone carefully measured. I'm certain King Damien has explained the political pressures that influenced his father's expectations. Alara studied Victor carefully, an uncomfortable suspicion beginning to form in her mind that she could not fully articulate. Something about his careful phrasing, his insistence on discussing political pressures rather than simply acknowledging the cruelty of what had happened, felt deliberately evasive in a way that troubled her deeply. If you'll excuse me, Alara said finally, choosing not to press further without more information. I have matters to attend to. She left the hall quickly, Victor's watchful gaze following her departure with an expression she could not fully read. As she walked back toward her chambers, unease continued to churn in her stomach, the brief conversation leaving her with more questions than answers about the true circumstances surrounding Damien's original rejection. That evening, she mentioned the encounter to Caleb during their usual evening discussion about Damien's condition, watching his expression carefully for any reaction. Victor Lang, Caleb repeated, his brow furrowing slightly. He's been a counselor since Damien's father's reign, very focused on political alliances and strategic advantage. Why do you ask? Something about the way he spoke felt strange, Alara said, almost like he was distancing himself from decisions he actually had a hand in shaping. Caleb considered this carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. Now that you mention it, Victor was quite vocal in supporting the alliance considerations that influenced Damien's father's pressure on him at the time. I always assumed he was simply following the old king's lead, but perhaps there was more to his involvement than I realized. Alara filed this information away, uncertain what to make of the strange, uncomfortable feeling that had settled over her since the encounter. She resolved to pay closer attention to Victor Lang's presence within the castle, sensing intuitively that something about the true story of her rejection remained hidden beneath the surface explanations she had been given. Over the following days, the bond between Alara and Damien continued its careful, tentative growth, small moments of connection building steadily, despite the underlying uncertainty about the eventual public declaration the curse required. They shared meals together, walked the gardens in comfortable silence, and slowly, cautiously, allowed themselves to imagine a future neither had believed possible only weeks earlier. But the shadow of Victor Lang's strange behavior lingered in Alara's mind, an unresolved thread she could not quite ignore, a suspicion that the true story of that devastating night 10 years ago might hold complications neither she nor Damien had ever fully understood. Alara found Caleb early the next morning, unable to shake the unease that had settled over her since her conversation with Victor Lang. She explained her suspicions in detail, watching Caleb's expression shift from careful consideration to genuine concern as he absorbed the implications of what she was suggesting. If Victor had a hand in shaping Damien's decision, beyond simply following the old king's wishes, that changes the story considerably, Caleb said slowly. Let me look into the old council records. If there's something hidden, I want to know before we bring baseless suspicions to Damien. Caleb spent the following 2 days quietly investigating, reviewing old council meeting records, speaking discreetly with servants who had worked in the castle during that period, piecing together fragments of information that had gone unquestioned for a decade. Alara waited anxiously, torn between hoping her suspicions were unfounded and needing to understand the true circumstances that had shaped the worst night of her life. On the third evening, Caleb requested an urgent meeting with both Alara and Damien, his expression grim as he settled into a chair within Damien's private chambers, a stack of old documents held carefully in his hands. What did you find? Damien asked, sensing immediately the seriousness of whatever Caleb had uncovered. Victor Lang orchestrated far more than simple political advice, Caleb said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. According to these records, he had been negotiating a secret alliance with the Ashford territory for months before your rejection of Alara, an alliance that required your marriage to their Alpha's daughter to secure favorable trade agreements. Alara felt her breath catch, old wounds threatening to reopen at the confirmation that something far more calculated than simple parental pressure had shaped that devastating night. Victor knew about the moon bond before it was even publicly revealed, Caleb continued, spreading the documents across the table for them both to see. He manipulated your father's insecurities about the kingdom's political standing, convinced him that a bond with an unranked family would jeopardize the Ashford alliance entirely. Your father's pressure on you wasn't simply about strength and perception, Damien. It was deliberately engineered by Victor to serve his own political ambitions. Damien's expression darkened with a fury Elara had not witnessed from him before, the careful composure he had maintained throughout her stay finally cracking under the weight of this devastating revelation. Victor let me believe I was making an independent choice, that rejecting Elara was necessary for the kingdom's survival. He manipulated my father, manipulated me, and let me destroy the one genuine connection I had ever felt, all to secure a trade alliance that benefited his own personal interests. There's more, Caleb said grimly, pulling out another document. The Ashford alliance ultimately fell through anyway, less than a year after your rejection of Elara. Victor never publicly acknowledged his role in the failed negotiations, allowing everyone, including you, to believe the rejection had been entirely your father's decision, driven purely by concerns about strength and reputation. Elara sat in stunned silence, processing the full weight of what this revelation meant. The humiliation she had suffered, the public rejection that had shattered her confidence and driven her from everything familiar, had been orchestrated not simply by fear and pride, but by calculated political manipulation that had ultimately served no one, achieving nothing beyond the destruction of two lives that might otherwise have found genuine happiness together. I need to speak with Victor directly, Damien said, rising from his bed, despite Otis's earlier warnings about overexertion, his weakened body trembling with barely contained rage. Damien, your condition, Elara began, concern overriding her own anger at the revelation. I have spent 10 years believing I alone was responsible for the choice that destroyed you, Damien said, his voice rough with emotion. I have carried that guilt every single day, blaming my own cowardice and pride for the cruelty I inflicted. Learning that a manipulative counselor engineered the entire situation for his own gain does not erase my responsibility, but I deserve to look him in the eyes and understand exactly how deeply I was deceived. Elara understood the need burning within him, though worry for his fragile health continued to war with her own anger at the injustice they had both suffered. Then I'm coming with you. They found Victor Lang in the council chambers, reviewing documents with the same careful, calculating expression Elara had noticed during their brief encounter days earlier. He looked up as they entered, something flickering briefly across his features, before he composed himself into practiced neutrality. Your Majesty, Victor said, rising respectfully. I wasn't expecting. Save the pleasantries, Damien said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that silenced whatever Victor had intended to say next. Caleb found the old records, the Ashford Alliance negotiations. Your manipulation of my father's insecurities. 10 years of silence about the true circumstances behind my rejection of Elara. Victor's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, his eyes darting briefly toward the door before settling back on Damien with something approaching resignation. Your Majesty, I acted in what I believed were the kingdom's best interests at the time. The Ashford Alliance would have secured decades of prosperity for Blackthorn. And it fell through anyway, Damien said coldly. Less than a year later, achieving nothing beyond the destruction of a genuine bond and a woman's entire life. I did not anticipate the negotiations failing, Victor admitted, his voice carrying a note of genuine, if belated, regret. By the time they collapsed, the damage to your rejection of the Voss girl had already been done. I saw no benefit in revealing my role, given that the outcome could not be reversed regardless. Elara stepped forward, anger finally overtaking the shock that had held her silent throughout the confrontation. You let an entire kingdom believe I was rejected for being unworthy, when the truth was nothing more than a failed political scheme that had nothing to do with my actual character or worth. Victor had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable under her direct accusation, though he offered no further defense of his actions. I apologize for the pain my manipulation ultimately caused. That was never my intention, though I understand that intention matters little against the reality of what resulted. Damien studied the counselor for a long moment, weighing the weight of a decade's betrayal against the practical realities of ruling a kingdom that still required experienced counsel. You will be removed from the council immediately, Damien said finally. Your position, your influence, everything you've built through calculated manipulation, ends today. I won't have you anywhere near decisions that affect the lives of people in this kingdom ever again." Victor nodded slowly, accepting the judgment without protest, perhaps understanding that far harsher consequences could easily have been demanded, given the severity of his deception. He gathered his belongings quietly and left the council chambers, leaving Damien and Alara alone, with the weight of this devastating new understanding. "I need you to know something," Damien said, turning to face Alara fully, once Victor had departed. "Learning about Victor's manipulation doesn't excuse what I did. I still made the choice to speak those cruel words in front of the entire pack. I still chose pride over courage in that moment, regardless of who orchestrated the pressures surrounding my decision." "I know," Alara said softly, though something had genuinely shifted within her upon learning the true circumstances behind that devastating night. "But it helps me understand that the rejection was never truly about my worth, Damien. It was about manipulation and fear that had nothing to do with who I actually was." "You were never unworthy," Damien said fiercely, stepping closer despite his weakened condition. "You have never been unworthy. Not for a single moment since the day the moon bond first connected us. I destroyed something precious because I was too afraid and too easily manipulated to trust my own heart over the calculated schemes of people who valued political advantage over genuine happiness." Alara felt tears threatening for the first time since Damien had walked back into her life weeks earlier, the weight of 10 years of carried humiliation finally beginning to lift under the clarity of this painful but liberating truth. She had spent a decade believing herself fundamentally lacking, unworthy of the bond the moon had chosen for her, when the reality had been nothing more than political manipulation, exploiting a young alpha's deepest insecurities. "Thank you for telling me this," Alara said quietly, "for not hiding behind Victor's manipulation as an excuse for your own choices, while still helping me understand the full truth of what happened." "You deserve to know," Damien said simply. "Whatever happens between us now, you deserve the truth after carrying false blame for 10 years. They stood together in the quiet council chamber, the weight of revelation settling into a strange, cathartic silence between them. Something had shifted fundamentally in that moment, not erasing the pain of the past, but providing clarity that allowed both of them to finally separate genuine character from the manipulation and fear that had shaped such a devastating chapter in both their lives. As they walked back toward the private chambers together, Alara felt the moon bond stirring more powerfully than it had in years, no longer tangled with confusion about her own worth, but strengthened by newfound understanding and the genuine courage Damien had shown in confronting the truth regardless of how painful that confrontation had proven to be. 3 days after Victor Lang's removal from the council, Damien collapsed again, this time in the middle of a routine meeting with his remaining advisors, the sudden severity of the episode sending the entire castle into a panic. Alara rushed to his chambers the moment word reached her, finding Otis and Diane already working frantically over his weakened body, the black veins now spreading rapidly across his chest and reaching dangerously close to his throat. "What happened?" Alara demanded, fear sharpening her voice as she took in the alarming sight of Damien's pale, unconscious form. The partial bond restoration slowed the curse, but it was never enough to stop it entirely, Diane said grimly, her hands moving carefully over Damien's chest as she assessed the damage. The stress of confronting Victor, combined with the underlying progression that never fully halted, has accelerated things dangerously. We may have only a day left, perhaps less. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. All her careful hesitation and cautious pacing suddenly rendered meaningless against the brutal reality of a timeline that had run out completely. She stared at Damien's unconscious form, the man who had spent weeks patiently earning back trust she never expected to extend again, now teetering on the edge of a death that would arrive regardless of whether she had finally found her answer. "I need him awake," Alara said, her voice steadying with sudden, fierce determination. "I need to speak with him." Otis administered a careful remedy, designed to bring Damien back to consciousness, though his expression carried little optimism about how much longer such measures would continue working. Slowly, Damien's eyes fluttered open, disoriented and weak, though recognition flickered across his features the moment he saw Alara's face hovering above him. "Alara," Damien whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," Alara said, taking his hand without hesitation, the gesture feeling entirely natural, despite everything that had once stood between them. Diane says we're running out of time. I need to make a decision now, tonight, and I need you to understand something before I do. Damien's weak fingers tightened around hers, his eyes carrying a mixture of hope and fear that mirrored her own turbulent emotions. Whatever you decide, Alara, I need you to know that these past weeks with you, even under these terrible circumstances, have meant more to me than anything in the past 10 years combined. I'm not deciding out of pity, Alara said firmly, needing him to understand the full weight of what she was about to say. I'm not deciding because guilt is forcing my hand, or because Diane's magic requires urgency. I've watched you these past weeks become someone entirely different from the frightened young alpha who once destroyed everything between us. I've seen genuine humility, genuine courage, and a willingness to face painful truths that most people would rather avoid entirely. Damien remained silent, listening with rapt attention despite his obvious weakness, understanding somehow that this moment carried significance far beyond simple survival. The bond never fully disappeared, Alara continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. I told myself for 10 years that I had let go completely, that I had moved on entirely without needing you. But some part of me clearly never released that connection. Not fully. Or the curse would have claimed you long before now. I choose this, Damien. Not because you're dying, and not because ancient magic demands it. I choose you because these weeks have shown me who you truly are, beneath the mistakes of your past. Diane, standing nearby, spoke urgently despite the emotional weight of the moment. Time is critical. If you're certain of this choice, the restoration must happen now, and it must happen publicly before the pack, exactly as the curse requires. Damien struggled to sit up, despite his obvious weakness, determination burning in his eyes, despite the fragility of his condition. Then let's not waste another moment. Word spread rapidly through the castle, as preparations began for an emergency gathering in the Great Hall, the same space where Damien had once delivered the cruel words that started this entire crisis. Wolves throughout the kingdom rushed to assemble, drawn by urgent messengers and the unmistakable tension rippling through every corner of the castle grounds. Alara stood in a small antechamber, her heart pounding as she prepared to walk into the same hall where she had once suffered the worst humiliation of her life, this time carrying the weight of a decision that could either restore everything that had been broken or fail catastrophically if her feelings proved insufficient to satisfy the demands of the ancient curse. Caleb found her there, his expression carrying both hope and genuine concern. Are you certain about this, Alara? Once you make this declaration publicly, there's no taking it back. I've never been more certain of anything, Alara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, despite the fear coursing through her. I love him, Caleb. Not the arrogant young alpha who rejected me 10 years ago, but the man he's become through genuine reflection and hard-earned humility. I need the entire kingdom to witness that truth, exactly as they witnessed my rejection all those years ago. Caleb nodded, pride and relief visible in his expression. Then let's not keep him waiting any longer than necessary. Alara walked into the great hall to find it packed with wolves from across the kingdom, the same faces that had once watched her humiliation, now watching with an entirely different energy, anticipation and hope replacing the cold indifference of a decade ago. Damien stood near the throne, supported carefully by Otis, his weakened form trembling with the effort of remaining upright, the black veins now visible along nearly his entire throat. Silence fell over the hall as Alara made her way toward him, every eye following her progress with an intensity that once would have overwhelmed her completely. Now, she walked forward with quiet confidence, understanding fully the significance of what she was about to declare in front of everyone who had once watched her cast aside. She reached Damien's side, taking in the visible strain his condition placed on his ability to remain standing, and felt her resolve strengthen further at the sight of his obvious suffering. This was not the powerful, untouchable Alpha King who had once dismissed her so cruelly. This was a man who had faced his own worst mistakes with genuine courage, who had earned back her trust through weeks of honest vulnerability rather than empty apology. 10 years ago, I stood in this hall and was told I was unworthy, Alara said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. I was humiliated in front of everyone I knew, discarded because of manipulation and fear that had nothing to do with who I actually was. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, many faces carrying visible discomfort at the memory of that devastating night. Today, I stand here of my own choice, Alara continued, turning to face Damien directly, her eyes meeting his with unwavering resolve. Not because ancient magic demands it, and not because guilt or pity have forced my hand. I choose Damien Cross because I have witnessed, over these past weeks, the genuine transformation of a man who has faced his mistakes honestly, who has shown me courage and humility that far surpasses the arrogant pride that once destroyed everything between us. Damien's eyes filled with an emotion he made no effort to hide, gratitude and disbelief mixing openly across his weakened features as the entire kingdom witnessed his vulnerability without the careful mask he had worn for a decade. I claim this bond freely and completely, Alara declared, her voice ringing with genuine conviction throughout the silent hall. I choose Damien Cross as my mate, not because circumstances demand it, but because I love the man he has become, flaws and all, and I refuse to let fear or old wounds prevent us from claiming the future the moon once intended for us both. For a moment, nothing happened, the hall holding its collective breath in anticipation. Then, Damien gasped suddenly, his body convulsing as a wave of golden light seemed to ripple outward from the point where their hands had joined, the black veins along his skin beginning to visibly recede for the first time since the curse had taken hold. Diane rushed forward, her eyes wide with amazement as she watched the ancient magic respond exactly as the old texts had described, the genuine, freely given declaration, finally satisfying the requirements the curse had demanded. Damien's breathing steadied gradually, color returning rapidly to his previously pale features, as the poison that had threatened his life for weeks finally began to release its hold entirely. The assembled crowd erupted into astonished murmurs, witnessing the visible transformation with growing wonder, understanding they were watching something extraordinary unfold before their eyes. Damien straightened slowly, strength returning to his body with remarkable speed as the curse continued its retreat, until finally, he stood tall and steady, the black veins completely vanished from his skin, as though they had never existed at all. "It's broken," Otis said, his voice filled with genuine amazement as he examined Damien carefully. "The curse has fully released him." Damien turned to Alara, tears he made no effort to hide, streaming freely down his face, an expression of pure gratitude and love, replacing every trace of the guarded coldness that had once defined him so completely. "You saved my life," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "in more ways than I could ever properly express." "We saved each other," Alara said gently, her own eyes shining with unshed tears, as the weight of 10 years finally began to lift completely from her heart. "I found the strength to forgive, because you showed me the courage to genuinely change." The great hall erupted into cheers, the assembled crowd witnessing, not just the miraculous breaking of an ancient curse, but the restoration of a bond that had once been so publicly and painfully destroyed. Damien pulled Alara close, and for the first time in 10 years, the Alpha King of Blackthorn allowed himself, in front of his entire kingdom, to embrace vulnerability, love, and genuine happiness without any fear of what such openness might cost him. News of the broken curse spread through the Blackthorn kingdom faster than any royal proclamation could have traveled, whispered from household to household, until every corner of the territory understood that their Alpha King had been saved by the very woman he had once cruelly cast aside. The kingdom that had witnessed Alara's humiliation now buzzed with a very different kind of energy, curiosity and cautious hope replacing the cold indifference of 10 years earlier. In the days that followed, Damien's strength continued returning steadily, the last traces of the curse's damage fading from his body entirely, under Otis's careful monitoring. He moved through the castle with renewed vitality, though something fundamental had shifted in the way he carried himself, the cold, commanding distance replaced by a quiet warmth that had not been present in years. Alara remained at the castle during this period of recovery, though uncertainty about her future continued to linger beneath the surface of their reconnection. She had a bakery waiting for her return, a life she had built entirely on her own terms, and while the bond with Damien had been genuinely restored, the practical questions of how their two very different worlds might eventually merge remained unresolved. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the curse had broken completely, Damien found her in the castle's private gardens, sitting quietly beneath the same tree where they had first acknowledged the returning bond weeks earlier. He settled beside her, his presence no longer carrying the fragile weakness of those difficult early days, but something steadier, more grounded than she remembered from even their brief courtship a decade ago. "You've been quiet today," Damien observed gently. "I've been thinking about Nora and the bakery," Elara admitted. "I promised her I would return once things settled here, and I don't know how much longer I can reasonably delay that promise." Damien nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was expressing, without needing further explanation. "I don't want to ask you to give up everything you've built for yourself. That life belongs to you, earned entirely through your own strength and hard work. I would never want to take that away from you, not after everything." "But," Elara prompted, sensing there was more he wished to say. "But I also can't imagine continuing to rule this kingdom without you beside me," Damien admitted honestly. "Not as an obligation, and not because ancient magic demands it, but because these weeks with you have shown me the kind of partnership I never believed I deserved after everything I destroyed. I don't know how to ask you to choose between two lives you've built, one here and one in that city. I only know that I don't want to lose you again." Elara considered his words carefully, understanding the genuine vulnerability behind them, so different from the commanding certainty that had once defined the young alpha who had rejected her so completely. "What if we didn't have to choose entirely between them?" she asked finally. "What if I could build something new, here, that honors both the life I created for myself and the future the bond has restored between us?" "What did you have in mind?" Damien asked, curiosity and hope mixing in his expression. "I love baking," Elara said thoughtfully. "It gave me purpose and independence during the years I spent without you. I don't want to give that up entirely, even as Luna of this kingdom. Perhaps I could open a bakery here, within the castle grounds or the nearby market, something that belongs entirely to me, separate from titles and expectations, while still building a life alongside you as my mate." Damien's face broke into a genuine smile, something Elara realized she had rarely witnessed from him even during their recent weeks of careful reconnection. "I think that sounds perfect. I would love nothing more than to watch you build something extraordinary here, exactly as you did in that human city, proving to this entire kingdom the strength and independence that Victor Lang's manipulation once tried to convince everyone you lacked." Elara felt warmth spreading through her chest at his genuine enthusiasm for her independence, rather than any expectation that she abandoned the identity she had worked so hard to build. This, she realized, was the fundamental difference between the frightened young alpha who had once prioritized appearances over genuine connection, and the man beside her now, who understood that true partnership required celebrating rather than diminishing each other's individual strength. Over the following weeks, Elara traveled briefly back to the human city to explain the situation to Nora, who listened with wide-eyed amazement at the incredible turn of events, though genuine happiness for her friend quickly overcame any initial shock. Nora agreed enthusiastically to take over full ownership of the original bakery, allowing Elara to focus on building a new establishment within the Blackthorn Kingdom, while maintaining a connection to the life and friendship that had sustained her during the difficult years of healing. Elara also took the opportunity to reconnect carefully with her own family, who had distanced themselves following her humiliation a decade earlier. The reunion carried its own complicated emotions, old hurt mixing with cautious hope for reconciliation, though the truth about Victor Lang's manipulation helped ease some of the lingering tension that had defined their relationship since that devastating night. Her parents, upon learning the full truth of the political scheme that had orchestrated their daughter's public rejection, expressed genuine remorse for their own silence and distance during those painful years, opening a careful path toward healing family bonds that had suffered alongside the romantic one. Back in the Blackthorn Kingdom, preparations began for a formal ceremony that would publicly establish Elara as Luna, undoing the humiliation of a decade earlier, with a celebration that would honor both the pain of the past and the genuine hope of their restored future. Damien insisted on personally overseeing every detail, determined that this ceremony would reflect none of the coldness and calculated political maneuvering that had defined the disaster of 10 years prior. On the day of the ceremony, the great hall overflowed with wolves from every corner of the kingdom, gathered to witness the formal claiming that would forever replace the memory of that devastating rejection with something entirely different. Elara stood at the entrance of the hall, dressed simply but elegantly, feeling none of the anxious uncertainty that had once defined her relationship with this space, only quiet confidence and genuine anticipation for the future unfolding before her. Damien waited at the front of the hall, standing tall and strong, every trace of the curse's damage completely erased from his healthy, vibrant form. As Elara walked forward, the assembled crowd watched in respectful silence, many faces carrying visible emotion at witnessing the restoration of something that had once seemed permanently and tragically broken. 10 years ago, I made the greatest mistake of my life within these walls, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as Elara reached his side. I let fear and manipulation convince me that rejecting the bond the moon had chosen for me represented strength, when in truth, it represented the deepest cowardice I have ever known. The crowd listened intently, many remembering with fresh clarity the events of that painful night, now understanding the deeper truth behind circumstances they had once accepted without question. Today, I stand before all of you to formally and completely claim Elara Voss as my mate and Luna, Damien continued, turning to face her directly, his eyes carrying open affection without any trace of the guarded coldness that had once defined his public persona. Not because ancient magic demands it, though I am eternally grateful for the mercy of that second chance. I claim her because she has shown me, through her strength, her compassion, and her willingness to forgive genuine transformation, exactly what true partnership and leadership should look like. Elara felt tears of genuine joy threatening as she listened to his words, understanding fully the significance of this moment, not just for their own personal healing, but for an entire kingdom witnessing a different kind of leadership, one built on humility and genuine accountability, rather than cold pride and calculated appearances. I claim Damien Cross in return, Elara said, her voice steady and clear, not as the arrogant young alpha who once wronged me, but as the man he has become through genuine courage and reflection. I choose this future freely, understanding fully both the pain of our past and the hope of everything still ahead of us. As their hands joined once more before the assembled crowd, a soft golden light rippled outward, gentler now than the dramatic surge that had broken the curse weeks earlier, a quiet confirmation of the genuine bond, now fully and completely restored between them. The great hall erupted into celebration, cheers and applause filling the space that had once witnessed such devastating cruelty, now transformed into a place of genuine hope and restored love. In the months that followed, Elara opened her new bakery within the castle grounds, quickly becoming a beloved gathering place for wolves throughout the kingdom, proof of her independent strength standing proudly alongside her role as Luna. Damien ruled with renewed warmth and wisdom, the lessons learned through his near-death experience and genuine reconciliation with Elara, shaping a leadership style built on humility rather than the cold detachment that had once defined his reign. Victor Lang's manipulation became a cautionary tale told throughout the kingdom, a reminder of the dangers of prioritizing political calculation over genuine human connection, ensuring that future counselors understood clearly the consequences of manipulating an alpha's most personal decisions for selfish political gain. Nora visited occasionally from the human city, marveling at the transformation in her friend's life, while maintaining the treasured friendship that had sustained Elara through her most difficult years of healing. The original bakery continued thriving under Nora's careful management, a living reminder of the strength and independence Elara had built entirely on her own terms, long before fate and forgiveness brought her back to the kingdom she once believed she had left behind forever. As seasons passed, and the Blackthorn Kingdom continued flourishing under the guidance of an Alpha King, humbled by love, and a Luna, who had transformed her deepest pain into extraordinary strength, the story of their reconciliation became legend throughout the Northern Territories, a powerful reminder that even the deepest wounds, born from fear, pride, and cruel manipulation, could ultimately heal into something far stronger and more genuine than anything that existed before the breaking. Damien Cross had once believed that strength meant ruling without vulnerability, without genuine connection, without the courage to admit fault or seek forgiveness. It took a forbidden curse, the threat of certain death, and the extraordinary mercy of a woman he had deeply wronged to teach him the truth that had eluded him for so many years. True strength required humility, honest accountability, and the courage to be genuinely vulnerable with the people who mattered most. And Elara Voss, once told she was unworthy of standing beside an alpha king, had proven through quiet resilience and hard-won independence that her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval or acceptance. She returned not as a broken woman seeking validation, but as someone whole and complete, choosing love freely, because she recognized genuine transformation, not because she needed anyone to complete her sense of self. Together, they built a partnership rooted in honesty rather than obligation, in mutual respect rather than calculated political convenience, proving to their entire kingdom that even the most devastating rejection could, with genuine courage and hard-earned humility, transform into the foundation of an unbreakable and lasting love.